Yeah, my name is Rivka Galchin, as Susan introduced me. I'm a novelist and essayist, as well as a teacher of writing. I'll be moderating tonight's conversation with the absolutely marvelous writers, George Saunders and Matthew Salesses. We're broadcasting on Crowdcast, and we want you, the audience, to be part of the conversation. The chat is open for your comments. PEN America staff will also be answering your questions in the chat throughout the event and sharing information about the participants. If you have questions, there's going to be a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen for your questions. This event will be live captioned. Please see links in the chat for access. And we will do our best to provide periodic visual descriptions for low vision viewers in our audience. Right now, we are in a frame on the left side of the screen. All three of us look like we could be held captive in someone's basement, but happily are not, with blank walls behind us. As we see branding for PEN America and the PEN World Voices Festival in the corners, and there's a chat with lots of comments on the side where people are telling us where they are watching from, and we'd love to hear where you're watching from. So let's get started with the event. Tonight, George Saunders and Matthew Salesses will be in conversation to question the politics of teaching people how to tell stories and know what a story is. I will now introduce the writers, Matthew and George, but both of them are too absurdly accomplished for a one-line bio, which I'm asked to offer. But rest assured, both are humane, brilliant, distinctive, and singular writers, as well as teachers of fiction. I use she, her pronouns. I am a cisgender female. I'm wearing a blue shirt. And I wanted to invite our authors to also provide a visual description of themselves and share their pronouns. And then we'll go on to our conversation. So we'll start with Matthew.
I'm a cis Asian male. Wearing horn-rimmed glasses, black and a gray polo shirt, and white headphones.
I'm George. I'm a cisgender male wearing a cap to disguise my quarantine mullet, and a big old honker set of headphones that make me look like an astronaut, and big glasses and a mustache and beard. So there's not much of me to see, but and I'm wearing a light brown shirt.
Okay. Wonderful. So we're here tonight. We're going to talk, both of you, your most recent books are not novels. It's not collections of short stories. They are craft books. Matthew's book is called Craft in the Real World, Rethinking Fiction Writing and Workshopping. And George's book is called A Swim in a Pond in the Rain, in which Russians give a masterclass on writing, in which 4 Russians give a masterclass on writing, reading, and life. So I guess I wanted to start with the question, and I'll ask you first, George. I mean, you've been writing and teaching for a long time. You've worked in all sorts of forms. What was it about this moment? Why was it now that that you turned to write a craft book? I've often taught my own students little craft homilies that you've given impromptu that are hilarious and wonderful in interviews, but you've collected a lot of things here. So I wondered, what was the moment that gave rise to putting together this book?
I think it was, I'd written a novel finally, or something like a novel. And then I went on tour for it, and I kind of got out of touch with my love for writing a little bit. And also my teaching had changed. So I probably won't actually teach this class again. So it was kind of I guess like a little bit of a collecting of the breath, like, okay, why do you love stories? Do you still love them? Why do you love teaching? And I sort of imagined it as just a sort of short grounding break before I started in again.
And Matthew, you also, I had written already, more than 5 books and in different genres, and now you're turning to do this project. And I wonder, what was the moment that brought you to it?
Yeah, I had been writing about craft for a while, and especially how the workshop can kind of better serve writers of color. And I kind of, I actually would have loved it if somebody else had taken up the book writing, the craft book writing. It just seemed like somebody needed to get it out there, and I had the writing, at hand, and so it seemed like a good time to do it.
And Matthew, I noticed that like a touch point in this book, or especially with my own sensitivity, the way that I read it is I noticed when you would bring in your own teachers and your own experience in workshop. And for example, one writer who comes up at several points is Margot Livesey. And I guess I wanted to sort of ask you to share a little bit with our audience about, some of those early or formative teaching experiences when you were the student and what you took from them and what those were. You share some in the book, but I wanted to.
Yeah, Margot was amazing, is amazing and extremely generous with her time. And she had this kind of open door policy. And I learned a lot from workshop, but quite a lot more maybe from just kind of working on the same story over and over again with her week after week. I mean, she would sit down, have had, complete marks all over the pages every week, and would talk me through why she had made every single edit. And I just learned a lot about how she revised there and how it might help me, and how the language had so many consequences on the page, and how when you change something, on page 5, it changes everything else in the story. And it was also kind of an experience in thinking about what we can do for our students and mentoring students through, those years in which they really are asking for help.
And one thing that both of you do that I love in this book is you do a few kind of counterfactual rewrites of passages and sort of consider how you might describe basically the same thing, and it has a completely different impact on the emotion, the energy, the humor, whatever, So those passages were so incredible for me. And in terms of teachers, I also wanted to ask you, George, there were both many living human teachers that I know have been very important to you. But in this book, you're talking about, 4 dead Russian teachers. And you're saying that you're actually kind of putting that class to bed. This is a little bit of a farewell to it. And I was, you're not dead, you're not Russian. How did these people become foundational teachers for you? Because it seems they are foundational teachers to you. I don't think maybe I'm wrong in that reading.
George is a cisgender.
No, you're right. Yeah. Yeah. No, I came from a kind of a weird background for a writer. So I wasn't an English major. I was a geophysics major. So I think I found maybe Tolstoy one summer when I was in New Mexico working for this an oil delivery company. And I just, how some writers just get under your skin, and they seem to be, from my experience was I would read a lot of books and just not know what the hell they were about. I didn't have anyone to teach me them. And I thought, well, apparently literature is this stuff that that the reader is made to misunderstand. It's so difficult, the reader can't get into it. And when I read Tolstoy, and I think it might have been Master and Man, that felt to me, in my parlance of the time, like a movie. Like I got it. It was about a person who didn't want to die, So it somehow the cinematic nature of it and the moral ethical stakes kind of got through my nonsense a little bit. And I thought, I can actually understand literature, So that was kind of like, I think the writers still speak to me because they got in when I was very unformed. Kind of like the first rock show you go to, you always love that band a little bit. So, and they're such simple stories. They're really kind of almost fairy tales. So I found that for teaching, they're kind of useful because they're so simple, and a lot of things that might complicate the work in a contemporary work are just absent. It's all samovars and horses and snow. And so it's kind of a chance to just look at the simplest form of a story, maybe. And then from there, of course, you can build on it. But.
I also sort of, one thing, in some ways, George's book focuses more on what you learn from reading, and Matthew's book focuses a little bit more on what you learn from the workshop discussion, but both of them cover both of those areas in depth. And I guess it's sort of, because it is the Zoom era, I wanted to ask you both, if it won't make you sick to your stomach, you can pass on this question. But these are, you know, how has it been trying to generate the kind of, and because I think both of these books acknowledge that, you know, it's not that the teacher's at the front of the class with some amazing wisdom and everyone needs to take notes and then they'll know everything, but that it's some sort of kind of dynamic that gets built up between people that sort of brings out energies in both people and all the students in the classroom that weren't there before. And I guess I wanted to think a little bit about what that's been like for the past year, when I can say in my own experience, when I was teaching, I was both like, I myself felt more needy and more attached to my students, perhaps in an unhealthy way, but also frustrated about generating that sense of trust and openness. So I wondered how that has been for the two of you. Maybe Matthew, we'll start with you.
Yeah, it's hard. I mean, I think not only just kind of adjusting to a different kind of teaching, but like you're saying, I was exhausted the entire semester, or both semesters, or 2.5 semesters, and my students seemed even more exhausted than I was, and of course that like affected their writing, and it was harder for them, I think, to kind of generate the amount of writing that we're kind of used to, or I was used to, in a workshop in person, and of course the kind of personal connections. I mean, I was just saying I ended up just spending a large chunk of the beginning of the class having people check in and say how their life had been in the last week since we had seen them, or 5 days since we had seen them, just so we had some sense of like life outside of the computer screen, which sometimes seems like unreality now, as if we've kind of stepped into this weird Zoom land.
Yeah.
And George, how has it been in the basement with the mood lighting?
I actually had a pretty good workshop. I was in a different house than this where the connection was better. But what I noticed was, okay, and this actually speaks to something I've noticed over the last 5 or 6 years. I feel like my best work with my students is happening not necessarily in the 6-person workshop, but in my edits. And then in my phone, I do an hour-long phone call with the writer after they've had time to look at the notes. And I noticed myself just over the years, kind of, you know, in a feeling of suspicion of the workshop, moving the weight to those two things. So I spend a lot more time on line edits, and I kind of say to myself, we're going to get through the workshop. Hopefully some benefit will accrue, but the real conversation takes place one-on-one with the writer. And I even tried a third of the workshop where we just skipped the workshop, and I would read and give a one-on-one, you know, we'd have a really nice talk on the phone. That was really nice. And it kind of, in spite of Zoom, it made me feel kind of more bonded to this last group than maybe I would have expected. So I think the trick is that, you know, for me to say, always let the workshop interrogate the workshop. And one way to do that is to break it down into small components. So you're not really a workshop. You're just 6 people, 1 mentor, getting off alone together as much as you can. And part of what you're doing there is you're diffusing whatever negative effects the workshop will inevitably have. That seems to me that it's sort of like you're messing with it from the inside, and Zoom somehow helped with that a little bit. I don't know quite why.
A lot of the stuff I do in the classroom is kind of like hands-on and working through kind of revision strategies, you know, cutting the stories up, pasting things all over the walls, and it was hard to try to figure out how to do that in the Zoom situation.
You know, one thing I was going to ask you is how your teaching has evolved just over time. Like I know the sort of the very first teaching job I had, there was that feeling of like, this plane had just landed, everyone was screaming and crying, it had almost crashed. It was amazing that no one had died. And suddenly they're like, it's flight school, you know, and they're letting you run it. And I think I was drawn to like really kind of trying to find some rule somewhere that I could offer people. And that's certainly changed for me. And I wonder for you too, both, like, I know that your teaching has changed, but how has your approach to teaching, to reading with students altered?
Yeah, I had that same moment, I think, going to the classroom. No, I actually didn't realize how close, or maybe that the plane had crashed until I was in the classroom myself and thinking, but why is this plane staying up? And so it really was kind of like being in the classroom in a teaching role that made me realize that the things I kind of was annoyed with in workshop were much more in my control than I thought, and that I could actually change them. And what I did was I kind of just spent a whole AWP just asking as many writers as I could how they were running workshop. And so many of them just said, the kind of same thing that I'd gone through in workshop and that I was kind of repeating in the classroom. And I was really hoping and looking for something else. And then Nami Moon said to me, she said, I just teach every workshop differently. And I was like, what are you talking about? She was like, oh, because every story and every writer is different. I thought, oh my gosh, what have I been doing? I've been, trying to get everybody on the same plane when they each have their own places to go. And so that really changed how I, was teaching individual classes. And as I was kind of trying to meet the needs of the individual student and story, I learned, of course, so many more things about how I could be flexible in workshop and how a different kind of workshop could go. And so trying, multiple different kinds of workshop in one course kind of opened the way to all this other experimentation.
Yeah. Now, one thing that you mentioned in your
when
book,
I first started, I was no, please.
I was
I've got a delay. I'm sorry. I don't mean to
I know
talk
you're
over
on delay. I know you're on delay. I was just going to mention that one of the things in Matthew's book that kind of is, on the one hand, it's obvious. On the other hand, it rocked my world. He sort of referred to this cone of silence in which the writer doesn't speak when they're being workshopped, and how he just thought, well, how about everyone asks the writer questions? Or how about he offers several different alternatives that are different from the cone of silence. And just how productive it seemed to just upend a couple, not because one of those modes is inherently sort of superior, but because each of them does something different. So that was like something I really loved from the book. George?
Yeah, no, I have over the years, I've noticed as I've become more confident, I have less of a shtick to sell, So now I say at the beginning, first of all, we're in a kind of a bullshit artificial thing that has, historically it has political and economic reasons for existing. We all know can be really obnoxious, and we know that we're talking about something ineffable, and we're doing it in 45 minutes, probably not having read deeply enough. And so admit all the problems with it. And then for myself, I've started saying, I'm not here to prove anything. I'm here to help, and then also to say, really honestly, what can I do? Well, the only thing I really can do is historically, I found a way to take my weird psychosis and learn how to publish stories in it. So when I offer it to them, I kind of really conditionalize it. Like, I'm not a great scholar. I'm pretty good at cutting text. So that's a certain bias that I have. I'll offer that to you, but please be suspicious of it. And at the end of the semester, you can feel free to tell me to take a leap. But I think to conditionalize everything and say, of course I have a viewpoint, of course I have a way of doing it. I'm going to give it to you full-throatedly as if I totally believe in it. But between you and me on the side, it's just my thing. You take as much of it as you can and throw the rest back at me. And that seems to, to always be saying, how can I help, instead of here's what you need to do is I think the main mantra.
That's beautiful. And that reminds me of one of the stories George talks about in his book is The Nose by Nikolai Gogol. And he uses this term, which SKAZ, the scabs. So just the way that the voice of the narrator is like, it's not just that it's unreliable, that you're sort of constantly kind of shifting between like one sort of slightly demented way of taking one slightly demented perspective to another slightly demented perspective, and that something is generated out of that and boundaried in that way. And it's almost like I like the way you describe that, like you're expanding the scabs to the outside of the story and to the composition realm, as something that didn't go so well in the end for poor Nikolai. So that also was reminding me, like, one thing I thought was an interesting way that you began your book, Matthew, is you began your book talking not about sort of ideas that maybe we all have our sort of preformed strong opinions about, like how should we identify, you know, race and gender, and introduce the strange, or who, you know, what is strange, and you know, what needs to be introduced, what should be translated, all these things that people have quite rigid, kind of almost allergic reactions to. You start by kind of, if I may say, defamiliarizing that whole kind of way of dividing up the world, and you start with fantasy fiction, but you also even start with the idea of what about you have like a world in which someone comes from a culture where everyone refers to saying queried instead of said, and you kind of enter in that way. So I wanted to ask you about that opening, which I thought was so disarming, and one of the wonderfully rare experiences I had of feeling something open up and shift inside of me instead of kind of solidify and lock down and sort of. So I wonder how you came to that opening, and maybe why and when.
Yeah, it was actually, it was an essay or a series of blog posts where a friend of mine, an Asian American writer, had asked, maybe on Facebook or something, if anybody had recommendations of writers of color writing craft essays that were just on craft. And people couldn't really think of them. And I thought, well, what are we calling like just craft? Because the reason we're writing about race is because it typically hasn't been included in the discussion of craft, but it is actually a part of the decisions that we're making because we are making up these things on the page. I found myself in the book and in teaching, really, just, you know, especially with undergrads, asking like these very kind of basic questions, like what is actually craft? You know, like things that we just kind of skip right over. And when I asked that, I started to think, oh, well, it's just we're responding to what we get used to reading. Right? And so like the reason that say and ask work is because we've read a lot of say and ask. And if you came from a culture where you used a lot of comment and query, then that say and ask would really stand out. And it would seem like, why is this author using say and ask? Like this is a strange choice. And from there, I think you kind of, hopefully, you know, my goal was kind of to help, like you're saying, show the kind of mechanisms behind all of the different decisions we're making are actually kind of cultural expectations.
You know, and I wanted to transition that into a question I had for you, George. Like, one of the things that I love about this book, but that also I love about your writing, is I feel like, almost as you were describing, again, sort of your shtick as you sort of diminished it, is that I feel like you passionately mean the things that you're saying, and they're fully thought out. They're not sort of, you know, underlined or asterisks. And at the same time, you're sort of saying, except maybe not, you know, I mean, it's just me, I have no idea. And it feels like a very sincere, oh, maybe not, it might just be me. It feels very sincere. And in this book and in your life, which you've devoted decades to writing stories, and a long time to writing this book, you keep coming back to saying, I think literature can do something. But you keep it quite small and you sort of hedge it. But at the same time, you've devoted your whole life to it. And I wanted to ask you a little bit about that, because I sort of feel like it has a rich parallel with Matthew, who's also, I sort of feel like the book has this wonderful intensity and humility, sort of trying to make like an improvement, but not necessarily absolutely sure like how that's going to go. And I guess you had also mentioned that, you know, on tour you were tired. Sorry, the delay. I was just filling up blank space for no reason.
No, my fault. I think, you know, I was trained as a scientist, a geophysicist, and one of the things that they teach you is that you don't actually get any points for being sure, you know, in advance. That's the whole game, is you're not supposed to know. You're supposed to go in and see how it goes, and you might be rooting a little bit for your hypothesis, but
Yeah.
the main idea is to go in open-mindedly and stay that way. So I think that's true for sure. That's how I write, is to say, well, I think the story is going to do this, but maybe I hope it'll do something better. Also with teaching, to say, well, here's how it seems to me, but I certainly am not positive. So if you can, my student, if you can tell me otherwise, I'm happy to hear it. Likewise, I don't, one of the things I build into the workshop is a very deliberate number of times when I say to the class, please email me privately to tell me how I did on the comments. Were they helpful or not? Because everybody, one thing we don't talk enough about is people receive criticism in such different ways. Some people love it, nice, tough critique. Other people wilt. And I would say it's part of our job to see which person am I talking to, which again is a form of science, to sort of put your best notes out there. And then the next time I talk to the student, I'm thinking, I want to see how he took that. Was it helpful to him or not? So I'll sometimes say, of the things that I said in my notes, and I'll do like a 4 or 5 page text note as well as cuts and edits, what helped you and what didn't? And if they say, those edits really annoyed me or they made me feel bad, then we don't have to do it. So that's the scientific part where I don't know how I'm going to work with any individual student. That's the fun of it. But in order for me to know, it's got to be a two-way street. And if this person says, I don't believe this about craft, or I do, I have to be open to that, because it's not about what I think. It's about eliminating obstacles for that person in her particular journey. So it's all, to me, it's all kind of scientific, really, or logical, I guess, or rational.
And Matthew, you talked about sort of a little bit of an evolution. In your book, you talk a little bit about an evolution in your thinking from kind of approaching both your own work and with a kind of math and a plan and sort of laying it all out and kind of obeying some deeper, whatever that might be, the spirit of math, which I do think you mean in a rather quite different way than George was talking about. And then that kind of cracking and breaking down. And I think that's how you transition into rethinking all these different terms of craft, tone and plot. And I think, and you open up sort of, okay, well, if these are the things I'm developing and I don't even really know what my value system is when I'm using these terms. So I wanted to ask you a little bit about, it just seemed fun to write that part, or if you would, what was it to return to all these kind of really kind of familiar words and kind of unearth them and turn them around and inspect them and just
it was kind of more of the I kept asking those questions again, just like, if we're going to use this term plot, like, what is a plot actually? Does it have to be kind of the way that we're defining it, which is less a description than a kind of proclamation about how it works? If we're like describing it, really, we're saying like, what is it doing, and opening that as like a kind of way, a number of different doors that you could go down in different directions. Then I wanted to kind of get at something that could hold all of these different, ways a plot could work. I think when George was talking too, I was thinking about like the kind of, as a student, I felt like we were taught this kind of one foundation, and upon that foundation, we could all kind of build our own houses or something. But as I was teaching, I started to feel like, oh, these, like this one foundation doesn't seem to be the same foundation for everyone. And if we could just kind of get rid of the foundation and think there are all these different foundations there, then what is like the way to describe what it is? It's just a foundation rather than like what kind of foundation it is, or what you're kind of building on, just like the ground itself. And so I'm always trying to kind of like rewind a little bit for my students and for myself to think like, okay, I have this accepted meaning, but like, what is it actually? Like, where does it come from? And why do I think a word means this meaning? I had this psychologist friend, colleague, and I was asking her about her work, and she said she worked in this time lab. I thought, oh, this is cool. She must like study time travel or something. But it was actually, she was studying bilingual time and how bilingual people have a kind of different sense of time than monolingual people. And what she said was, the more impressions you have of a word, the quicker the word comes to you that in that particular with that particular context. And so for bilingual people, the context that they have to draw from is always twice as much or twice as little, however you're looking at it. And so it takes actually a longer time of processing to come to the word in the language that is spoken and the meaning of the word in that language. And so the kind of impressions is what I'm thinking about a lot in the classroom, that we've heard these terms so many times that we start to feel as if the way to understand them is to bring up the meaning without like even talking about all the context, all those impressions that have formed it. And if we just kind of go back there and say, well, like what were these impressions? Where did they come from? What was the context when you heard the word the last time? What was the context when you heard the word the time before that? We might see that it's either like a kind of all one context, or that actually everybody is coming from very different contexts, and we don't actually understand the word the same way. And then it's like a less helpful thing to talk about in workshop, because we're all kind of saying one thing but meaning different things.
I wanted to ask a little bit, a question. I have numerous friends who have read both of your books and who are not writers at all, and or maybe are writers but are not fiction writers, and who are musicians, or I wish I had a psychologist friend who read one, but I'm sure they're out there, and who read them and loved them and sort of felt they had learned something. And I guess I'm curious if that surprises you, that that's part of your audience.
Yeah, it has surprised me a lot, actually. I just, I was thinking so much like, what can I do? And I've always felt like, kind of as George was saying, I could do this very one specific thing, and I know this thing like pretty well, but I kind of don't really know that much about these other things. And so I was just trying to kind of offer the little knowledge that I had as a way, of kind of saying, here is a starting point, and from this you can kind of take it in any way that you feel like going. And I kind of anticipated the people that were taking the information would be writers and teachers of writing, and it has surprised me quite a bit to see how it's been applied, or how people from other professions, or just even people who are teaching kind of just kids in elementary school how to talk about books, how they've learned from it and how they've taken it in their own directions.
Yeah, it's really interesting the way that if you bear down on something, it always jumps the rails and becomes about something else. So for me, this book became a little bit about something, an idea that I first came through Buddhism, which is that, these words like plot and escalation and all these words that we use, those are okay. They're placeholders and they have a purpose. But when you lean on them, they splinter, they fragment. So plot is a word that we use to describe an experience that we have, or something, I guess, that causes an experience. But if you keep looking, it's much more useful to be in the more specific realm. So if you could put away the word plot and talk about the fundamental experience, and then go a step further towards specificity and say, where exactly did you have that response? Then suddenly you're kind of starting to leave a conceptual realm and getting into more of an experiential realm, and a lot of problems go away very quickly. The problem that Matthew just talked about of 15 people hearing the word plot a different way, that's really a problem. And if you can then get rid of the word plot and talk about a specific experience in relation to the text, I think you're taking a step towards equity in a way. That everybody now has their reaction and can describe it in their own words. So I think that my book taught me that somehow, for me, especially as sort of a bear of little brain, it's helpful to always say, and what else, or what next, or can you say it a different way? Can you be more specific? And when I do that, I find myself coming out of realms where I'm conceptually confused, down into, or maybe up into realms where I'm reacting to specific places in the text. Then suddenly I feel like I'm about twice as intelligent. And also sometimes you're entering into an intuitive realm where you really don't have a rational explanation, and you can confess that to the person's work. what, you know, because I really don't know why, but to me, it looks better with this cut out of it. You know, so there's a whole way in which a lot of problems that we have reading, writing, they go away if we keep moving in the direction of specificity and experience, I think.
Yeah, I find in the workshop, I'm often saying, say more about what you just have said.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
I can like watch the wheels turning where they're actually trying to figure out what they meant by what they said. And
Yes.
I really appreciated that kind of aspect of your book, George, and where it's always like, well, what was the response you actually had it, and where did you have it? Like where in the text did you have that response? You know,
Yeah.
I think that's always what's happening in the classroom too, when we're kind of dialing into, like you're saying, these things that we feel, but then, you know, actually articulating why we might feel it is where we do a lot of the work.
Yeah, and I think sometimes, especially late in the semester, there's a certain amount of quick reading and cursory note giving, and then the way that you find that out is when you say, "Oh, really? Oh, interesting. Where?" And you know, that's where somebody gets tense in a nice way.
Um, so both of you generously sort of offered to share a prompt with our audience, and I think that we're going to present those prompts so that everyone can see them. And I wanted to, Matthew, do you want to tell us a little bit about the origin story of this prompt?
Yeah, sure. So the prompt comes from a class that I took with the writer Matt Johnson, and he had us do this exercise, a kind of similar exercise where he kind of drew what looked kind of like a target on the blackboard, these, you know, 3 concentric circles, and asked us to identify different levels of audience, right? And he said, in the middle, in the, you know, the bullseye, who's the one person or, you know, person you write to, who sees all of your writing, you know, gets every single thing in the writing. And then we kind of did a slightly larger audience, and then, you know, kind of what I tell my students is a sort of bestseller level, which, you know, they're always surprised to find is not actually a million or 100,000 readers, but a few thousand readers. And for many of my students, they're kind of trying to identify their audience for the first time. Not that they haven't actually thought about it, they have, but they don't realize that they've thought about it. They don't realize that they've made choices in the text that actually say exactly who they're writing to. And in this way, they're able to kind of identify those things, and then to help that identification help that identification lead them to making more conscious choices in the text. And so my book, Craft in the Real World, it kind of rests on this premise of craft as a set of expectations. And the immediate question there for me, of course, was whose expectations are they, and where do they come from? And so audience is a way of kind of getting at that. And for in my kind of writing career, a lot of the change I've had as a person and as a writer has been changing how I understand who I'm talking to, and like who I really want to communicate with, who my writing is for, and what I want to do with that information. And I kind of started out writing to the figure of the father or mother, for me, an white adoptive parent, trying to explain my human condition to them. And as I found that in real life, not actually that fruitful, I started to think, oh, well, you know, like maybe I should be doing something different. And if it's not like kind of explaining that I'm a person too, then who could I talk to in a way that, you know, we kind of take our humanity already for granted, and are kind of moving from that to learning something about each other and our kind of shared experience. And so that path has really helped me as a writer, and I think it's pretty helpful for, at least for my students.
Nice. Beautiful.
George, do you want to
Okay, yeah.
orient
So
us a little
mine is,
to your prompt?
Sorry, I'm on a big delay. I'm like an 8-hour delay here. Yeah, so so my exercise comes from the book. It's Appendix B, and basically it's sort of like an icebreaker that I did for one class. And the idea is, I'll just give you the parameters real quick. You set a timer for 45 minutes, and then your job is to write a 200-word story. And the trick is you only get to use 200 words, not 199 and not 201. Oh, and also within that, I should say the story has to be exactly 200 words long, not a word longer or shorter. And you only get to use 50 words to do it. So this is really annoying to students, and you, especially because you usually do it in class and you tell them we're going to read it aloud afterwards, so they kind of hate you anyway. But then you're as you're doing it, you're kind of recording the words. You have to find a way to count the words. So if you say the cat jumped over the wall, you have to write down 1, the, 2, cat, blah blah blah. So what happens weirdly is, I think because the student is so anxiously keeping track of the words, she forgets her usual writing persona. You know how when you sit down at your desk, there's this little split-second thing that happens where a language becomes available to you. And also probably, Matthew, what you refer to, that standard kicks into place somehow. Who knows where it comes from, but there it is. This exercise kind of destabilizes that, your own expectation of what you'll sound like, because you're so frantically recording the words and you're running out of words, and then you have to repeat them and you start sounding a little bit like a kid's book. And the thing I found about this, I still can't explain, is that people who have written pretty static stories that are mostly just sort of description, some of them written 600 pages of this, with this exercise, that thing happens, which you can, again, speaking of labels, you can label it as rising action or whatever, escalation, but something happens towards the end of these little 200-word narratives where the people listening are kind of on the edge of their seats. They're kind of engaged. And often the writer will reveal something about herself that she's been keeping back. So you'll find people suddenly funny who weren't, or people who have always been kind of reflexively funny who suddenly get very lyrical. So I don't really know why it works, but you set a timer for 45 minutes and write this 200-word story. And I think it's always surprising what people come up with. It also will sometimes free up, especially if you do it in class, it frees up a sort of entertainer within, if that person exists. So if somebody has, like I did when I was young, if someone's laboring under the assumption that writing has to be very, very serious indeed, this exercise and the desperate desire not to fail in front of their peers will sometimes, show them a way of being entertaining or engaging, let's say, that they might not have known existed before.
I wanted to sort of
also, as a teacher, you can go out and get a coffee during it.
One thing I think that's interesting about that exercise is that, on the one hand, I feel that both of these books and workshop and life in general is about sort of finding a way to be more deliberate, more in control, know what kind of consequences each word choice has, basically to develop heightened control. And yet at the same time, this exercise and a lot of other things that get mentioned actually in both of these books are about finding a way to flee that control and allow something not pre-scripted to come out, not part of the set personality, not part of the set culture. And so that tension is interesting. So I guess I was just going to invite you a little bit to sort of reflect about how you place teaching in that tension, like teaching in that tension of becoming both more in control, more the owner of every decision, and yet not in control. Actually, at the end of my teaching term, I almost always share a little excerpt from an interview George probably gave sort of with his left hand 500 years ago, in which he sort of refers to like the controlling brain, which I believe is like, he talks about being like a sort of fat sailor in tights trying to sort of run the ballet, but then there's also this crazy monkey who pees on the carpet and breaks the lamp, and both of them work together to write the story. So I just was kind of curious if you guys have other ways you have of kind of doing that release? Like, I sort of feel like, Matthew, the entire part of your book where you're deconstructing things, on the one hand, it's an exercise in control. On the other hand, it's an exercise of like letting go of that, finding many, many different methods of letting go of that control. Do you feel like that's an issue with your students, trying to get them not to be so on top of everything?
Yeah, I guess as you're saying, Rivka, like for me, it's this kind of in life too. First, in order to kind of have any control, you first have to understand how you don't have control, or how you've been controlled, and where the agency actually is. Another thing I find myself saying a lot to my students, though, not only in creative writing classes, is just, well, why do you believe in free will so strongly? And the question is really about where we're putting our attention and how we're understanding. I think that what helps make that exercise work, George, I've done a kind of version of that, and it's gone really well too, is that you pay so much attention to each individual word choice that you're really, thinking carefully about, which words you are allowed to use and how you can put them in a way that, turns 50 words into a story into 100 words. Like, that's on its own a fairly difficult thing to do. And I tell my students there's a kind of like valley, and at the beginning you stand on this precipice and you think, everything is going to be great. The idea in my head is perfect, and I'm going to put it on the page, and it's just going to be like the best thing ever. And then you start writing, and all of these other things actually have all this influence over you, whether it's like your mood or like the things that you've been taught to do, the things you've been taught to value about literature, that kind of seriousness that you think literature should be. And suddenly you're in the valley, right? And as we kind of learn more about where these choices come from and what kind of tradition we're actually in and what it means that we're just kind of, say, only naming the race of characters who aren't white, then those things start to feel, I think, at first a little oppressive, right? Like you've always got to keep them in your head, and it's just so many things to keep in your mind. But as we identify them, they kind of start to become part of your subconscious, and you kind of train those things into the algorithms of your subconscious, and you're kind of slowly climbing up the valley to the other side. And on the other side, there's other precipice, but it's not the same precipice, and hopefully it's a kind of a better precipice. Precipice. Now I've just sunk myself.
That's a good title for something.
Exactly.
Yeah, I always think that, if you take this story down to its very, very basics, it's I think I would say it's something that responds to itself, mainly because you read it in order. So whatever you say at the beginning, you've kind of narrowed the field of play a little bit. And then the stories, no matter how wild it is or how realistic, it's reacting to itself in some way. So I think what I value as a reader is what I'll nebulously call honesty, which is that the story is honestly responding to what it's raised, whatever that is. So if you say, now for me, I'm honest when I'm being impulsive. I'm honest when I'm improvising more than when I'm planning, because my planning mind is kind of dumb and it puts together all these crusty old 1970s story models from all the bad movies I've seen. But if I can blurt some stuff out, that tends to be more honest. So for me, the model is kind of like a recording studio where if I have to get to play a guitar solo, I'm going to do 15 different improvisations in a complete spirit of non-planning and openness. But then I get to go back and pick the one that I like. And I also get to edit it. I get to combine it with another one. So in some ways, there's a combination of you see how much more maturely I'm putting this. There's no peeing monkeys anymore.
I love
but basically it's the same idea. There's a part of you that just blurts and knows the truth and says it and having fun, and then there's a part of you that reconsiders and tries to. I would say that second part is still somewhat intuitive. You're reading at speed and you're choosing the best improvisation, but Yeah, for me, I mean, when I was younger and I would plan things out, they always were just dead on arrival. They, like Flannery O'Connor says, a person can choose what he writes, but he can't choose what he makes live. So for me, that's part of it. Is if the prose is alive, whatever that means, then you're there somehow. You're there more honestly. And to me, that implies everything about everything else that we call style and structure and form and all that. The perfect form is the form which allows a series of honest blurts to exist, in a linear way or something like that. But I'm a big fan of intuition as being a kind of a intuition managed. It can become a conduit for a certain kind of crazy wisdom, I think.
We're going to turn to Q&A in just 1 minute, but I have a selfish question, and I'm in the audience. So, Matthew, one thing you mentioned, what an observation you made in your book is that children love to hear a story they already know. And I guess I was kind of curious, like, what is it we can learn about story from that? I mean, that's such a primal, kind of impulsive, unplanned, no persona kind of response. And what are we learning from that?
I mean, one thing we're learning, I think, is to be careful about what readings we're choosing for our students. That, as you kind of accrue a number of stories that all work in the same way, you start to be able to, learn more from the other things in the story. And it starts to seem like those things that have accrued are like the way a story should work. And one of the things I think that brings out for me is to think, well, we kind of have to introduce students to many different things. But also the second part, and I have kind of trouble putting these two together in a 14-week arbitrary period of time, is to think, if you're only kind of giving one of those things, one of those other things to a student, one of this kind of writer and one of this kind of writer, one of this kind of writer, then you're not kind of building that ability for them to see other things in the text, and we kind of have to do both, which is like introduce them to new things, but also introduce them to the traditions that those things fall in.
I'm going to open this up to some of the questions that are coming in from the audience. So one of the questions here is, how do you meet the needs of your students and the demands of teaching while also preserving the mental and creative space you need for your own work? We all have our pencils at hand and are going to write it down.
Yeah. Well, one thing at Syracuse, one thing that we have sort of had as a motto for many years is that we can't be good teachers of the students that we get who are at such a high level if we're not selfishly taking care of our own creative life. So it's kind of understood that that actually our creative lives are the first priority. And then in turn, we should make a kind of direct conduit to our practice to the students as we can. So to me, it hasn't really been a big dilemma. Sometimes at the end of the semester, I find my work suffering because I'm thinking too much about how to conceptualize ideas instead of just doing them. So, the idea of having to reduce ideas, I'm always happy at the end of the semester when I can just do it and not talk about it. But other than that, I haven't really found it that problematic, to be honest.
Yeah, I think it's like the valley thing. You kind of get used to it. And at the beginning, there's a kind of sharp learning curve where especially when you're instituting new models or trying to do new things, it does require kind of a large time commitment, large energy commitment. But it's like, if you think about how many of the kind of traditional silence workshops you've been in, and then how well you can run that just because you have all this accrued experience, you kind of have to put that energy, the same amount of energy and time, into whatever new thing you're doing. And beyond that point, it kind of levels out again, and you're doing about the same amount of work. I find I'm doing about the same amount of work as I used to do, and when I was teaching a silence model, but I had to do a lot of work kind of to get to that point. And I think probably most things are that way, like onboarding or whatever, to use the business term. And then once you're, actually, I don't even know what that means. Once you're on board,
Yeah,
then
we'll look it up later. We'll look it up.
Yeah.
take the flow where it's going. I'm not sure what comes after that.
Another question here is Matthew. You mentioned that you wanted to write a craft book that would better serve writers of color. In what ways have people of color been underserved in the traditional workshop MFA format, in your opinion? I am a writer of color and also teach in MFA programs. Thank you.
Yeah, there are so many ways, I think. Maybe I'll just talk about the way that the kind of silence thing works, and just trying to remember that the workshop actually exists in the world that we live in, and that when somebody who's marginalized in the regular world comes into the workshop and has to sit in silence, it's different from somebody who's been empowered by the rest of the world and comes into the workshop and sits in silence. And it's different too when that empowered person takes some time out from that power, but then is able to kind of recharge that power once they step out into the world again, versus somebody who sits in silence and then steps out into more marginalization. The model there is more harmful. I mean, if we're just thinking, like, I was just talking to a writer about this, and she said, my first rule is do no harm. If we're thinking do no harm, this is a kind of problematic way of thinking about a workshop. And I think a lot of the other things stem from thinking about audience. When the workshop is kind of primarily one thing, the audience assumed is often kind of like a similar audience for everyone, to the point where, like, sometimes we can end up writing to the workshop. I've also often had the experience of a group of 12 writers. As the semester goes on, certain things start to kind of reappear in different people's stories. And it's just the kind of persuasiveness and like energy of a workshop working together. But it also means that we have to be really aware of the fact that people are, kind of engaging with different expectations. And that if we say something like, the reader thinks this, that's a specific reader. And the way that we kind of talk about the reader, I think is often like the problem behind why it seems like we're kind of aiming everything towards a certain audience, and why you get comments like, with some writers of color, I remember kind of comments like, can you describe the food more, or something like, can you make this like seem more exotic, basically, because this is how I can enjoy it, right, from a specific audience's perspective.
Another question here that's come in, actually connecting in some ways to sort of the quiet student. Do you have and this is for both of you, do you have an exercise for bringing out the shy, isolated students who are afraid to leap in? How can we both step aside and facilitate to inspire the fire inside students?
Well, my teaching situation might be unusual because it's only, the 6-person workshop, but I pretty much just note that and then try to gently find out if they would like to talk more. And often, it's a little bit transparent, but I'll just say, the thing you said was unbelievably brilliant. If you feel comfortable with it, I'd love to hear more, because, there's no reason for you to hold back. But some people, I also think I'm realizing that in a workshop, it actually isn't that necessary for everybody to talk, really. If my goal is to help them eliminate obstructions, and the person feels that being quiet is okay with her, then my job is to go, all right, that's no problem. And none of the students I get are ever disengaged. It's not like they're trying to pull a fast one by not talking. But some people, I think that's really their comfortable style. So this goes back to what I said earlier, which is my job is to very sneakily, I guess, surreptitiously figure out what the person is comfortable with. And I've had students who were tormented by not being able to talk in class. And I've had students who were very, very happy, and they actually felt that they learned faster when they could just absorb. So that's on me to figure out which person she is, and then honor that in the teaching.
Yeah, I think for sure, like, the students, right, are kind of individual students. They have their own kind of individual learning styles. Sometimes we can just ask that. I think we could just straight up ask them what works best for them, but also, but there are ways, I think, that where a student who maybe wants to speak up more but does feel kind of shy, there are ways of kind of restructuring the workshop to help them. I think there are a bunch of models in the book, but one model that could work in that case is having letters come in a week before the actual workshop or a few days before the workshop, and letting the student read them over beforehand and generate a list of questions, so that then they're not kind of trying to pull it out of thin air. I also think sometimes the student is it's not as much shyness, but the student needs more time to process things, and in order to kind of say something or ask a specific question, they actually need a pause where they can think about what just happened and then kind of respond to it. And some people need more time than others. And one thing I've seen help is if that student maybe can bring in a friend who can take the notes for them, even take one thing off the table so that they have more energy to spend on kind of processing and being able to talk in the moment. And if the instructor knows, kind of making more room for the writer to have time to do that processing. I mean, I think there are ways that we can help those students for sure.
Nice.
What do you think? What is nourishing for you personally as a writer? I mean, ideally, with all its flaws, and I sort of feel like both of you sort of engage with the way the workshop is sort of a demon and an angel, and it can do all sorts of things. But what for you personally at this point, now that you're an experienced writer, you can be given 45 minutes and write something if you need to, and you're not going to go into a panic. What is actually nourishing for you in terms of holding on to your love of the form? Is it reading? Is it movies? Is it a nap? What maintains your own connection to the form? Because to do something professionally is to have more than a kind of crush on the field, I'm kind of, any thoughts on that?
Yeah. Well, I find that teaching really helps because one, you have to reread the stories you're teaching with a much more serious mind. And then, I mean, this is maybe a little sentimental, but when I get into a class with 6 people who remind me of my young, foolish self, who believe so much that they can make a life out of writing, and they're looking to me to help them, it really makes me, take it seriously. And then also when something happens in the class where the distinction between teacher and student vanishes, and you're suddenly in that kind of eternal space, that really, makes me happy. And then also the nap, actually, to say, for me to say, don't always be talking and conceptualizing about writing, because that's not a way to live. Also, don't always be writing, sometimes you have to go out into the world with a little beginner mind and see, remind yourself that you don't know very much about it, but I think it's a challenge though, as you do it more and more. And I think it's, the way that academy works is, and also the professional life, the publicity life, it's easy to get overloaded with, articulating things and sort of advocating things. And that is a kind of a buzzkill. So I think a little bit of time management has been important, to just say, you have to, basically I have to be somewhat, I don't know about happy, that's not quite the right word, but I have to be somewhat energized to work and, to protect your time a little bit.
Yeah, I do too. I've never understood the people who can write when they're sad or very upset. I always feel very unproductive at those points. I just want to kind of curl up and, not engage with anything at all. I think Margot actually used to call those periods filling up periods, and she would say sometimes you just kind of empty yourself out, and you need to just spend some time filling up, whether that's kind of reading a bunch of books, watching movies, going to something that has always kind of inspired you, playing with your kids. I think there are definitely those moments when you feel pretty worn out, maybe more moments this year than in most years, where you do kind of need to just find a way to fill yourself back up.
Yeah.
Have you had moments in the classroom that you wish you could rewind and do over?
Oh, every class.
Okay.
Really. Yeah, because I'm actually one of, like Matthew described, the people who take a little time to process. I'm like that. So somebody will say something and I just will go past me before I know what to say. And then an hour later, I'm like, oh, I could have handled that, so yeah.
Yeah, me too. I mean, I think that's part of just learning and growing, right? I hope so, because I've been telling my kids this. that, you make these, right, like these choices in the moment, and later you think about them and you think, oh, I could have done a little better there. And ideally, I think, the way George was talking about, like asking the student what was helpful and what was not helpful. I have the student do the kind of same thing, right? The writer can kind of writes a reflection on how the workshop went and can say, like, these things I thought were really helpful and these things I thought were not very helpful. And that actually really helps me to hopefully get better, both on a general level, but with the individual student as well.
Yeah.
I'm going to read one more audience question that's unfortunately going to have to be our last, but we do have time for you to give your answer. Don't feel rushed. Can you speak about how the workshop strategies you've described can be adapted for undergraduate creative writing classrooms that tend to have larger class sizes, so for example, 25 to 40 students?
I think I haven't taught an undergraduate workshop in a few years, and I found them really difficult because, for one thing, with our grad students, we get 700 applications and pick 6 people to come. So they're already reading and writing at such a high level. And in the undergraduate workshop, I used to find that, there are kids writing stories who hadn't really read very many of them in some cases. And then it's a whole different kind of job. So I think I'll defer to Matthew. I hope you have something.
25 to 40 students, that's pretty tough. I mean, I don't know that a workshop is maybe the best strategy for a class of that size. I actually think probably you want to do something different, or maybe split the class up a little bit and do smaller groups that can workshop. But at 25 to 40 students, I don't know, workshop maybe is not the best way to go. Maybe it's more like writing exercises and presentations and trying to facilitate small group discussions on the readings or something. But I think we could all probably agree that workshop's not the only, right? I think sometimes we think a workshop is how creative writing is taught, but it's not, right? And it's over the course of history, it has not been, right? And for the vast majority of history, it's not been the way that writing has been taught, and there are so many other ways to do it. I think I actually really like workshop, and I think it has a lot to offer. But I think in a class of that size, I would probably try to do something else.
And both of your books actually have a lot of just very practical, tear them out of the book and put them in your notebook kind of exercises that you can do in a class. That aren't necessarily workshop exercises, that are writing exercises that you could do. Even with, one thing I admired is they could even work with very different age groups, but depending on what you chose as the sort of base text for the exercise. So I feel like that's something both of these books have.
I like the idea that, in a way, just to quickly say, I have noticed thinking of writing as more of judo. Like, people have talent and it's going in a certain direction. So you're not generating all the energy. You're just maybe stepping aside or staying quiet, or, and so I think even with a class of undergrads, you could, if you gave them exercises, they would make progress. The writers among them would make progress. And it's not really all about the teacher in a certain way. And sometimes the best thing you can do is just say, well, human beings have always had talent of different degrees. I trust that you have talent, and let's, I'll give you a few things to kick around and, to try to lure your talent out.
That's a beautiful note to end on. I wanted to thank you both for being here this evening, and I wanted to thank all the audience for joining us. The Penn World Voices Festival is not over, so visit penn.org/festival to hear more from your favorite authors, and have a great rest of your evening for all of you. Thank you so much for your time, for your work, for your honesty. Thanks.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Rivka. Bye. Pleasure. Thank you, Matthew.
So much.
Bye.
Thank you.